Eleanor Whitford's hands trembled as she read the paper. Not a love letter, but a bill of sale. Her father had gambled everything away, and the debt collector had a peculiar form of payment in mind. Her. In 2 weeks, she would marry a stranger named Caleb Monroe, a man who'd purchased her like livestock at auction. No courtship, no choice, just a signature on a contract that turned a woman into currency. She had 14 days to escape, rebel, or accept that her life was worth exactly $3,000, the price of her father's cowardice. Before we begin Eleanor's journey from commodity to choice, please take a moment to like this video and comment with your city below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's step into 1852 Oregon Territory, where one woman's forced beginning would lead to an unexpected ending. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor noticed it first because her father wouldn't meet her eyes at breakfast. Thomas Whitford sat hunched over his coffee, shoulders curved inward like a man bracing for a blow, and when he finally slid the envelope across the table, his fingers left damp prints on the paper. She didn't open it immediately. Something in his posture, the defeated slump, the way his jaw worked silently, made her afraid of what the paper contained. Outside their small cabin, morning light filtered through Douglas firs, painting the rough-hewn walls with amber. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a jay called out sharp and insistent. The Oregon frontier in spring was beautiful, indifferent to human suffering. "Read it," her father said quietly. Eleanor broke the seal. The handwriting was precise, businesslike. As her eyes moved across the lines, the room seemed to tilt to Mr. Thomas Whitford. This letter serves as confirmation of debt settlement terms agreed upon March 15, 1852. In lieu of cash payment for gambling debts totaling $3,000, you have agreed to the marriage arrangement between your daughter, Miss Eleanor Whitford, and Mr. Caleb Monroe of Monroe Ranch, to be finalized no later than April 30th, 1852. Mr. Monroe has generously agreed to forgive all outstanding debts upon completion of marriage contract. Failure to fulfill these terms will result in seizure of property and livestock, as well as pursuit of criminal charges for debt evasion. Respectfully, James Corrigan, legal representative. Eleanor read it twice. Then a third time, because surely she'd misunderstood. Surely her father, the man who'd taught her to read, who'd promised she'd have choices her mother never did, hadn't just sold her to settle his debts. "Eleanor," he began, $3,000. Her voice came out strange, distant. "You lost $3,000 gambling, and your solution was to trade me like a horse?" "It wasn't like that. I was going to win it back. I had a system." "A system?" She laughed, sharp and bitter. "Your system cost you your daughter." Thomas flinched. "Monroe's a good man. Respected. He owns the largest ranch in 3 counties. You'll want for nothing. Except choice. Except freedom. Except any say in my own future." "You're 23 years old, Eleanor. Most women your age are already married with children. This way you'll have security, a good home. This way you'll have your debts cleared." She stood abruptly, chair scraping against wood. "Don't dress it up as if you did this for me. You did this for yourself." Her father's face crumpled. For a moment she almost felt sorry for him, almost. But then she looked down at the letter again, at the words agreed upon and marriage contract, and the sympathy died. "Who is he?" she asked. "This Caleb Monroe. Have you even met him?" "Twice. He's a rancher, runs cattle and horses, built his place up from nothing over the last 10 years. He's older than you, 38, I think, never been married." 38 and never married. Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What's wrong with him?" "Nothing's wrong with him. He's just been focused on building his ranch. Now he wants a wife to help run it, someone educated who can manage the household accounts, maybe teach the ranch hands children. So he wants an employee, not a wife. He wants a partner." "Partners choose each other, Father. They don't buy each other at auction." Thomas slumped further into his chair. "I didn't know what else to do. Corrigan was threatening to take the cabin, the land, everything your mother left us. I thought if I could just win enough to pay him back." "How long?" Eleanor's voice cut through his excuses. How long have you been gambling? Silence. Outside, the jay called again, mocking in its cheerfulness. 2 years, he finally admitted, since Mother died. Eleanor closed her eyes. 2 years of lies. 2 years of watching their small savings dwindle, of her father disappearing into town for days at a time, always with an excuse. She'd thought he was grieving. She'd made allowances, picked up the slack, managed their small household alone. And all the while, he'd been betting away their future hand by hand, card by card. I have 2 weeks, she said flatly. Eleanor, 2 weeks to prepare for marriage to a stranger. 2 weeks to accept that my life is worth $3,000 and a cleared debt. She looked at her father, this man she'd loved and trusted. I'll never forgive you for this. She walked out before he could respond. The morning air hit her face, cool and sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Their cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by wilderness that stretched for miles. Normally, the vastness comforted her. Out here, a person could be free, could build something from nothing, but today the forest felt like a cage. Eleanor walked until her cabin was out of sight, until the only sounds were her boots on soft ground and the whisper of wind through needles. Then she sat on a fallen log and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Sold, like property, like livestock, like a piece of furniture being transferred from one owner to another. She thought of her mother, dead 2 years now, buried in the clearing behind the cabin. Catherine Whitford had been a strong woman, educated in Boston before she'd followed her husband west for adventure and opportunity. She'd taught Eleanor everything, reading, writing, mathematics, even Latin. Education is freedom, she'd always said. No one can take knowledge from you. But they could take everything else, apparently. Eleanor pulled her knees to her chest, pressing her forehead against the rough fabric of her dress. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, there was just a hollow, burning anger, and beneath it, something worse. Fear. What kind of man bought a wife? What kind of man paid $3,000 for a woman he'd never met, never courted, never chosen in any real sense? The possibilities made her skin crawl. He could be cruel, violent. He could be the kind of man who saw women as possessions to be used however he pleased. The letter said nothing about him except his name and occupation. For all she knew, she was being delivered to a monster. The sun climbed higher. Eleanor knew she should go back. Should start preparing, whatever that meant. How did one prepare to marry a stranger? To surrender one's entire future to a man who saw her as a solution to a debt problem? But first, she needed to think, to plan. Could she run? She had some money saved, coins hoarded from selling eggs and vegetables in town. Maybe enough for a stagecoach ticket, though she wasn't sure where she'd go. East, perhaps, back to civilization, to cities where a woman might find work as a teacher or seamstress. But running meant abandoning her father to his debts, to the consequences of his choices. Despite everything, the thought made her hesitate. He was weak, foolish, selfish. But he was still her father. Could she leave him to face ruin alone? And if she ran, what then? A woman alone on the frontier with no family, no references, no protection. The world wasn't kind to women without men to vouch for them. She'd be vulnerable in ways she couldn't fully imagine. She could refuse, simply say no, let her father face whatever consequences came. But the letter had mentioned criminal charges for debt evasion. Her father could end up in prison, and she'd still lose everything, the cabin, the land, the life she knew. Or she could go through with it. Marry this Caleb Monroe, whoever he was, and hope that her father's assessment was right, that he was a good man, that she'd be treated well, that maybe, eventually, she could find some measure of happiness in a marriage that began as a transaction. The choices all felt like different flavors of surrender. Eleanor stayed in the forest until afternoon shadows grew long and her stomach cramped with hunger. When she finally returned to the cabin, her father was gone. Off to town, probably, to celebrate his solved problem with whatever money he had left. The coward's escape. She moved through the cabin mechanically, lighting the stove, preparing a simple meal she barely tasted. Every object seemed different now, tinged with impermanence. In 2 weeks, none of this would be hers. She'd be in a stranger's house, cooking his meals, managing his household, sharing his bed. The thought of that last part made her hands shake. That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling beams her father had cut and fitted when she was just a child. She remembered helping him, handing up tools, feeling proud and important. That little girl seemed like someone else entirely, someone naive enough to believe her father would protect her, that love meant something more than a line item in a ledger. Sleep came in fitful waves, punctuated by dreams of faceless men and locked doors. The next morning brought a visitor. Eleanor was feeding their 3 chickens when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, hand instinctively going to the knife at her belt. A woman alone had to be cautious, but relaxed slightly when she recognized the rider. Martha Hendricks, their nearest neighbor, pulled her mare to a stop near the chicken coop. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, weathered by frontier life but sharp-eyed and kind. "Heard the news," Martha said without preamble, swinging down from her saddle. "Wanted to see how you're managing." Eleanor shouldn't have been surprised. News traveled fast in small communities, especially news this scandalous. "I'm managing," she said, scattering another handful of feed. "That's what people say when they're drowning but too proud to reach for the rope." Martha studied her with frank concern. "Your father really went through with it then? Trading you to Monroe to clear his debts?" "Apparently I'm worth exactly $3,000. I'm still deciding whether to be insulted it wasn't more." Martha snorted. "Dark humor, good sign, means you haven't given up yet." She paused. "You know anything about Caleb Monroe?" "Only what my father told me. Rancher, 38, never married." Eleanor scattered the last of the feed. "What do you know about him?" "I know he's honest. Built his ranch through work, not theft or cheating. Treats his hired hands fair, pays better than most. Keeps to himself, doesn't drink or gamble." Martha's expression softened. "I know he's not cruel, Eleanor. Hard, maybe. Strict in his ways, but not cruel." "How reassuring. I'm being sold to a man who's merely hard instead of violent." "I'm not saying this is right. What your father did—" Martha's jaw tightened. "What he did was wrong, cowardly. But if it's going to happen anyway, at least Monroe's the type who'll keep his word. If he's promised to treat you well, he will." "He didn't promise me anything. He promised my father's creditor a settlement. I'm just the currency." Martha was quiet for a moment, watching the chickens peck at the scattered grain. "You know you don't have to go through with it," she said finally. "You could come stay with me and Henry. We'd figure something out." The offer touched Eleanor more than she wanted to admit. "And my father?" "Would face the consequences of his own choices, like a man should." Eleanor considered it. Martha and Henry had a good farm, ran sheep, and grew wheat. They'd take her in, she knew, would protect her if Corrigan came demanding his payment. But they'd also lose everything if the creditor decided to pursue them for harboring her. She couldn't ask them to risk that. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I can't let you take that risk." "Then what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." Eleanor met Martha's eyes. "But I need to see him first, this Caleb Monroe. I need to look him in the face and judge for myself what kind of man I'm being sold to." Martha nodded slowly. "That's fair. You want me to ride out there with you?" "No, this is something I need to do alone." "When?" "Tomorrow." The decision solidified as she said it. "Tomorrow I'll ride to Monroe Ranch and meet the man who bought a bride." Eleanor spent the rest of the day preparing. She mended her best dress, the dark blue wool her mother had made 3 years ago. She washed her hair in the creek, dried it by the fire, braided it carefully. Not because she wanted to look pretty for him, the thought made her stomach turn, but because she wanted to face him on her terms, composed and dignified. She would not arrive at his ranch like a frightened child. She would arrive as a woman demanding answers. That night, Thomas came home late and drunk. Eleanor pretended to be asleep as he stumbled past her bed to his own corner of the cabin. She listened to him settle into restless sleep, heard his occasional mumbled words, fragments of apology, justification, self-pity. She felt nothing. The love she'd had for her father had been burned away, leaving only ash. Morning came cold and clear. Eleanor dressed carefully, every button a small act of defiance. She braided her dark hair tightly, pinned it in a coil at the base of her neck. In the small, cloudy mirror her mother had brought from Boston, she barely recognized herself. Her gray eyes looked hard, older than 23. Her mouth was a thin, determined line. Good. Let him see what his money had bought. Not a blushing bride, but a woman angry enough to burn the world down. She saddled their mare, Belle, with efficient movements learned over years of frontier life. Her father still slept, or pretended to. She didn't wake him. There was nothing left to say. The ride to Monroe Ranch took 3 hours across rolling hills still green with spring growth. Eleanor had been this direction before, had seen the Monroe property from a distance, vast acres of grazing land, solid outbuildings, herds of cattle and horses that spoke of prosperity. But she'd never had reason to visit. Now she was riding toward her future prison, and every step Belle took felt like a countdown. The ranch house came into view around mid-morning. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, built from solid timber with glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport from the coast. Not a mansion, but substantial, prosperous. The kind of house that said its owner had ambition and the will to achieve it. Several men worked in a nearby corral, breaking a young horse. They looked up as Eleanor approached, curious but not unfriendly. One of them called toward the house. A man emerged onto the porch. Eleanor's first thought was that he looked nothing like she'd imagined. She'd pictured someone soft, wealthy, the kind of man who bought wives because no woman would choose him freely. But Caleb Monroe was tall and lean, built like someone who worked his own land. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples. His face was weathered, creased at the eyes and mouth by sun and time. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, surprise perhaps, though he covered it quickly. "Miss Whitford," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Monroe." Eleanor dismounted, grateful her hands didn't shake. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I thought it prudent to meet the man I meant to marry before the wedding." Something flickered in his eyes. "Prudent," he repeated. "Yes, I suppose it would be." He gestured toward the house. "Would you like to come inside? I can have one of the men take your horse." "I'll walk her to the barn myself, thank you. I don't intend to stay long." "As you prefer." He waited as she led Belle toward a well-maintained barn, then fell into step beside her. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Your father said you might need time to adjust to the arrangement." "Adjust?" Eleanor kept her voice level. "Is that what he called it?" "Among other things." She glanced at him sidelong, trying to read his face. His expression was neutral, controlled. "And what do you call it, Mr. Monroe? This arrangement where you pay my father's debts in exchange for a wife?" "I call it practical." He opened the barn door for her. Inside, the space was clean and organized, the scent of hay and leather and horses. "Though I can see you might use different words." "I have several words for it. None of them fit for polite company." To her surprise, his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I imagine not." Eleanor led Belle into an empty stall, removed her saddle with practiced efficiency. Caleb Monroe watched without offering to help, which she appreciated. She didn't need him to treat her like someone fragile. When she was done, she turned to face him fully. "I want to understand something, Mr. Monroe. Why would a successful rancher pay $3,000 for a wife? Why not court someone properly? Why not let a woman choose you freely?" He met her gaze directly. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the barn's dim light. "Courtship takes time I don't have. This ranch needs a partner who can manage the household, keep the books, eventually teach the workers' children. I need someone educated, capable, and willing to work. When your father's situation came to my attention, it seemed a practical solution to both our problems. My problem being that I'm an unmarried woman of 23 with limited prospects. Your problem being that you need an employee but prefer to get one through marriage." "Yes." The bluntness startled her. She'd expected excuses, justifications. Instead, he simply acknowledged the ugly truth of it. "At least you're honest," she said bitterly. "I try to be. Lies complicate things unnecessarily." He paused. "I understand you're angry, Miss Whitford. You have every right to be. But I want you to know this marriage won't be what you might fear." "And what do you think I fear, Mr. Monroe?" "That I'll treat you as property, that I'll use my position to abuse or demean you, that this arrangement will trap you in misery." His voice was quiet, matter of fact. "I won't do any of those things. You'll have your own space, your own work, your own say in how the household runs. I need a partner, not a servant. There's a difference." Eleanor wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to believe him, but wanting made a person vulnerable, and she'd already been betrayed once by a man she trusted. "Pretty words, Mr. Monroe, but words don't mean much when a woman has no choice but to accept them." "No," he agreed. "I suppose they don't." He looked at her steadily. "What would convince you? Of my intentions?" "Nothing. Because regardless of your intentions, I'm still being forced into this. I still have no real choice. I'm still being traded like cattle." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. Caleb Monroe's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been regret. "Then I suppose all I can offer is my word that I'll do my best to make this arrangement bearable for both of us. I know it's not what you wanted. It's not exactly what I wanted either, but it's what we have." "What you wanted?" Eleanor laughed sharply. "You arranged this. You could have said no." "Your father would have lost everything, would likely have gone to prison. You would have been left alone with nothing." He said it simply, as if stating facts. "I could have said no, but then where would you be?" The question hit like a slap because she'd already asked it herself, already run through all the alternatives and found them wanting. He was right. Without this arrangement, her situation would be even worse. But that didn't make her feel any less trapped. "So you're my savior, is that it? I should be grateful you're rescuing me?" "No. You should be angry that you needed rescuing in the first place. I don't want your gratitude, Miss Whitford. I just want us to be clear about what this is and isn't." He moved toward the barn door, paused. "The wedding is set for April 30th. Between now and then, you're welcome to visit the ranch, to ask questions, to see what your life here would look like. Or you can stay away until the day itself. Either way, I'll respect your choice in the small things since you don't have choice in the larger matter." He left her there in the barn, standing among the horses and hay, her heart pounding with anger and fear and something else she couldn't quite name. She'd come to judge him, to see the monster or fool who'd buy a wife like livestock. Instead, she'd found a man who spoke plainly, who acknowledged the wrongness of the situation even as he participated in it, who offered respect but couldn't offer freedom. Eleanor wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. She found him on the porch when she finally emerged, ready to ride home. He stood as she approached, this tall, quiet man who would soon be her husband, whether she wanted it or not. "Thank you for seeing me," she said stiffly. "Thank you for coming." He hesitated. "Miss Whitford, Eleanor, if I may, I meant what I said, about wanting a partner, about treating you with respect. I know you have no reason to trust those words right now, but I hope, in time, I can prove them true." Eleanor looked at him, really looked, saw the lines around his eyes that spoke of hard work and harder years, saw the careful distance he maintained, giving her space, saw the hands that were calloused from labor, not soft with inherited wealth. He wasn't a monster. That should have been a relief. Instead, it just made everything more complicated. "Time," she said quietly. "Yes, I suppose we'll have plenty of that. A whole lifetime of it, in fact, whether we want it or not." She mounted Belle, gathered her reins. Caleb Monroe stepped back, giving her room. "Safe ride home," he said. Eleanor didn't answer. She turned Belle toward home and didn't look back, though she felt his eyes on her until she rode out of sight. The ride home felt longer than the journey out. The sun climbed high and hot, unseasonably warm for spring. Eleanor's mind churned with everything she'd seen, everything he'd said. He'd been honest, at least, brutally, uncomfortably honest about the nature of their arrangement. He'd offered respect, autonomy in small things, partnership in work. He hadn't tried to pretend this was a love match or a fairy tale. He'd acknowledged her anger as justified, but he'd still agreed to it, still paid the money, still claimed her like property, still expected her to honor a contract she'd never signed. When Eleanor reached home, her father was working in the small garden behind the cabin, pulling weeds with the frantic energy of guilt. He looked up as she dismounted, hope and fear warring on his face. "Well?" he asked. Eleanor led Belle to the small shelter that served as their barn. She unsaddled the mare, brushed her down, gave her water and hay. Her father waited, hovering, desperate for absolution she wasn't ready to give. "He seems like a decent man," she said finally, not looking at him. "Honest? Fair? Not cruel." Thomas sagged with relief. "I told you, but that doesn't make this right." Eleanor turned to face him. "It doesn't make what you did any less wrong. It doesn't mean I forgive you. It just means that when I marry him in 2 weeks, I might not be walking into hell, just purgatory." "Eleanor, I'm tired, Father, and I have a great deal to prepare. We're done talking." She walked past him into the cabin, closed the door firmly, and let herself finally cry. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations that felt surreal. Martha came by daily, helping Eleanor sew new dresses, teaching her the intricacies of managing a large household. Other neighbor women visited too, bringing advice and gifts, linens, preserves, a beautiful quilt stitched by 8 different hands. They meant well, Eleanor knew. They were trying to welcome her into the community of married women, to make this transition easier. But their cheerful chatter about married life, about pleasing husbands, and managing households made her want to scream. None of them knew what it felt like to be sold. A week before the wedding, a package arrived from Monroe Ranch. Inside, Eleanor found a bolt of ivory silk, fine lace, and a note in neat handwriting. "For your wedding dress, if you wish. If you'd prefer something else, there's money at the general store in your name." It was signed simply C.M. Eleanor ran her fingers over the silk. It was beautiful, expensive, the kind of fabric her mother had loved. He'd chosen well, she realized. Somehow, without knowing her, he'd chosen fabric that suited her perfectly. She hated that it moved her, hated that this small gesture of consideration could penetrate her armor even slightly. But she made the dress anyway, working late into the nights by lamplight. If she was going to do this, and she was, because all the alternatives were worse, then she'd do it on her feet, looking him in the eye, dressed in silk that reminded her she was worth more than $3,000, even if the world didn't agree. The night before her wedding, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She rose before dawn and walked to her mother's grave in the clearing behind the cabin. The wooden marker her father had carved was already weathering, the letters of Catherine Whitford growing faint. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," Eleanor whispered to the grave, to the memory of a woman who'd always seemed so strong. "I don't know if I should run or fight or just accept this. I wish you were here to tell me what to do." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth. No answers came. Her mother was 2 years gone, and Eleanor was alone with an impossible choice that wasn't really a choice at all. But standing there as dawnlight filtered through the forest, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would walk into Caleb Monroe's house with her head high. She would be no man's property, regardless of what papers said. She would find a way to live with dignity, even in chains she hadn't chosen. And maybe, she would find a way to be free. The sun rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Eleanor returned to the cabin to prepare for her wedding day, carrying her mother's strength like a talisman against whatever came next. The wedding took place in the small church at the edge of town, witnessed by fewer than 20 people. Eleanor stood in her ivory silk dress, feeling the weight of every eye on her, some sympathetic, some curious, a few disapproving. The women who'd helped her prepare had come, their husbands in tow. Martha stood near the front, her face carefully composed. Eleanor's father sat alone in the back pew, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Caleb Monroe waited at the altar in a dark suit that looked new, his expression unreadable. When Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, the last time she'd let Thomas touch her, she'd already decided. Caleb's eyes met hers steadily. No smile, no romance, just acknowledgement. This was happening. They both knew why. The preacher's words washed over her like distant thunder. She heard herself speak the vows, heard Caleb's deep voice responding. His hand was warm and calloused when he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. She noticed his own hand trembled slightly, the first sign of nerves she'd seen from him. Then it was done. She was Eleanor Monroe, a name that felt like a costume she hadn't chosen to wear. The gathering afterward was mercifully brief. Martha had prepared food at her farm, and people ate and offered congratulations that rang hollow in Eleanor's ears. She smiled until her face ached, accepted good wishes from people who acted as if this were a normal wedding, a happy occasion. Only Martha seemed to understand the truth behind Eleanor's composed facade. "You're stronger than you know," Martha whispered when she pulled Eleanor aside. "Remember that. And remember you've got friends if you need them." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Caleb appeared at her elbow. "The wagon's ready when you are," he said quietly, "unless you'd prefer to stay longer." "No." Eleanor's throat felt tight. "I'm ready." Her belongings, everything she owned in the world, had already been loaded onto Caleb's wagon that morning. 2 trunks of clothes, her mother's books, a few precious keepsakes. 23 years of life reduced to what could fit in a wagon bed. Thomas approached as they prepared to leave, his face blotchy with drink and emotion. "Eleanor, Goodbye, Father." She cut him off before he could launch into another apology she didn't want to hear. "I'll send word that I arrived safely." "I'm sorry. I know I keep saying it, but I am. I'm so sorry." Eleanor looked at this man who'd raised her, taught her to read and ride and think for herself, then sold her to pay his debts. "I know you are," she said finally, "but sorry doesn't change anything." She climbed onto the wagon seat beside her new husband before Thomas could respond. Caleb gathered the reins, clicked to the horses, and they rolled forward. Eleanor didn't look back. They rode in silence for the first hour. The trail to Monroe Ranch wound through forests and meadows beginning to bloom with wildflowers. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have found the journey beautiful. Instead, she sat rigid beside a man she barely knew, heading toward a future she couldn't imagine. "You did well today," Caleb said eventually. "I know it wasn't easy." Eleanor let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "Which part? Marrying a stranger? Pretending to be grateful? Leaving behind everything I've ever known?" "All of it." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "But I meant the way you held yourself. Dignified, strong. People will respect that. People will pity me. The poor girl whose father sold her to the highest bidder. Some will. But most folks around here understand that survival sometimes requires hard choices. They won't judge you for doing what you had to do." "Even if I had no choice in the matter?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "You didn't have a good choice, but you made the best of bad options, and that takes courage." Eleanor turned to look at him fully. His profile was stern, angular, weathered by years of outdoor work. "You're trying to make me feel better about this." "I'm trying to be honest. There's a difference." "And honestly, you think I should feel good about being purchased like livestock?" "No." He glanced at her, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe, or recognition of an uncomfortable truth. "Honestly, I think you should feel however you need to feel. Angry, resentful, afraid. It's all justified. But I also think you're stronger than this situation, and eventually you'll find your footing." "You sound very certain." "I am. I've been watching you, Eleanor. The way you handled yourself these past 2 weeks, visiting the ranch, asking hard questions, preparing for this day even though you hated every moment. That's not weakness. That's steel wrapped in silk." The observation unsettled her because it was too accurate, too perceptive. She'd spent 2 weeks trying to maintain her armor, and somehow he'd seen through it to the determination underneath. "Don't mistake survival for acceptance," she said. "I'm here because I had no better alternative, not because I wanted this." "I know." Caleb's hands were steady on the reins. "And I won't ask you to pretend otherwise." They lapsed into silence again. Eleanor watched the landscape roll past, trying to memorize the route in case she ever needed to leave in a hurry. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. She'd already started planning escape routes from a marriage mere hours old. The sun was lowering toward the western mountains when Monroe Ranch came into view. In the golden afternoon light, it looked almost welcoming. The solid house, the well-maintained outbuildings, the horses grazing in distant pastures. Eleanor could see why Caleb took pride in it. This was a place built by hard work and careful planning, not inherited wealth or luck. A woman waited on the porch, her hands clasped in front of her apron. She looked to be in her 40s, sturdy and practical, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "That's Sarah," Caleb said. She's been helping manage the house since my mother passed 5 years ago. She'll show you around, help you get settled. Eleanor felt a small measure of relief. At least she wouldn't be entirely alone with Caleb, at least not at first. Does she live here? She has a cabin about a half-mile away with her husband, Tom. He's my foreman. They're good people. You'll like them. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the house, and Sarah came down the steps with a smile that seemed genuine. "Mrs. Monroe," she said warmly, "welcome home." Home. The word felt foreign, but Eleanor managed a smile. "Thank you. Please, call me Eleanor." "Eleanor, then." Sarah's smile widened. "And you call me Sarah. None of this Mrs. Miller nonsense. We're going to be working together too closely for formality." She glanced at Caleb. "I've got supper ready whenever you two are, and I've prepared the upstairs rooms like you asked." "Rooms?" Eleanor looked between them. Caleb climbed down from the wagon, then offered his hand to help her. "I told you you'd have your own space. The master bedroom is at the front of the house. I've been using the smaller room at the back. You can have whichever you prefer, or we can—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "We can make whatever arrangement you're comfortable with." Eleanor stared at him. In all her imaginings of this day, all her fears about what her wedding night would bring, she'd never considered that he might offer her a choice about sleeping arrangements. "You mean we wouldn't—" "Not unless and until you want to," he said quietly. "I told you, Eleanor, I need a partner, not a— I won't force anything. You have my word." Sarah had discreetly moved away to start unloading the wagon, giving them privacy. Eleanor stood frozen, trying to process this unexpected development. Every married woman she knew shared a bed with her husband. It was simply what marriage meant, regardless of how the marriage had come about. "I don't understand," she said. What kind of marriage is this supposed to be?" "An honest one. One where we both know exactly where we stand." Caleb met her eyes. "I won't lie to you, Eleanor. Eventually, I'd hope this could become a real marriage in every sense. I'd like children someday, a true partnership. But I'm not going to demand that from you just because a preacher spoke words over us. You'll need time to adjust, to trust me. I'm willing to wait." "How long?" "As long as it takes." Eleanor wanted to call him a liar, to insist that no man would truly accept such an arrangement. But the steadiness in his gaze, the careful distance he maintained, everything about him suggested he meant what he said. "The front bedroom," she said finally. "I'll take that one." Something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe. "Good. It's larger, has better light. Sarah's made it ready for you." He turned toward the wagon. "Let me help get your things upstairs." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Caleb and Tom Miller, a quiet man with strong arms and an easy smile, carried Eleanor's trunks upstairs while Sarah showed her through the house. It was larger than it had looked from outside, with a good kitchen, a dining room, a parlor with actual upholstered furniture, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. The front bedroom was indeed spacious, with windows facing east and south that would catch morning light. Someone, Sarah, probably, had put fresh linens on the bed, placed wildflowers in a vase on the dresser, hung curtains that matched the quilt. It was a woman's room, carefully prepared for her arrival. "Caleb had me fix it up last week," Sarah explained, smoothing the quilt unnecessarily. "Wanted it to feel welcoming. He's been sleeping in the back room for the past month, getting it ready for this arrangement." She paused, studying Eleanor with sympathy. "I know this ain't how you'd have chosen things, honey, but Caleb's a good man, fair and decent. He'll treat you right." "Everyone keeps telling me that," Eleanor said softly, "as if it makes the situation less wrong." "No, I suppose it don't." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, patted the space beside her. Eleanor sat. "But since it's happening anyway, might as well know what you're dealing with. Caleb Monroe built this ranch from nothing. Started with $100 and a dream when he was 25 years old. Worked himself half to death for 13 years to make it what it is. He's stubborn, quiet, keeps his feelings locked up tight. But he's honest, and when he gives his word, he keeps it. He gave his word I'd have choice in personal matters. Then you will. I've known Caleb for 10 years, and I've never seen him go back on a promise." Sarah took Eleanor's hand. "I know you're scared. I know this feels like the end of everything, but maybe it could be a beginning too, if you let it." Eleanor wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe, possibly, this forced marriage could become something bearable, even good. But hope felt dangerous. Hope made a person vulnerable. "I'll try," she said finally. "That's all I can promise." That's all anyone can ask. They went downstairs to find Caleb and Tom in the kitchen, talking quietly over coffee. The men stood as the women entered, and Eleanor noticed how Caleb's eyes found her immediately, checking to make sure she was all right. "Supper's ready," Sarah announced. "Tom, we should head home and let these two have their first evening in peace." "We'll stay if you need us," Tom said, looking at Eleanor. "No trouble at all." Eleanor appreciated the implicit offer of protection, of witnesses to ensure nothing happened she didn't want, but she also knew she couldn't hide behind other people forever. This was her life now, and she needed to learn to navigate it. "Thank you, but we'll be fine," she said. "I'm sure you both have your own evening to get to." Sarah gave her one more encouraging smile, and then she and Tom left. Eleanor stood in the suddenly quiet kitchen, alone with her husband for the first time as married people, and felt the weight of that reality settle over her like a physical thing. "You must be hungry," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "Sarah left enough food for a week. She tends to overcompensate when she's worried." "Worried about what?" "About you, about whether I'll manage this right." He moved to the stove where pots still steamed. "She's known me long enough to know I'm better with horses than people." Despite herself, Eleanor felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "That's honest?" "I told you, I try to be." He started dishing up food, roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread. The smells made Eleanor's stomach growl, reminding her she'd barely eaten all day. "Sit, please." They sat at the large wooden table that could easily seat 8. Caleb had placed her at what was traditionally the wife's seat, at the right hand of where he sat at the head. Everything about it felt surreal. Playing house with a stranger, performing roles neither of them had chosen freely. "Tell me about the ranch," Eleanor said, needing to fill the silence with something neutral. "How it works? What needs managing?" Caleb looked up from his plate, seeming surprised by the question. "You want to know now? Tonight?" "Better now than fumbling through it tomorrow when people are watching." She cut a piece of chicken with precise movements. "You said you needed a partner who could help manage things. I'd like to understand what that means." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or appreciation for her practical approach. "All right, we run about 2,000 head of cattle, 300 horses. I've got 8 full-time hands, 4 part-time during busy seasons. Tom manages the daily work crews. Sarah's been handling the household accounts and supplies, but that should transition to you if you're willing." "What else?" "We sell cattle twice a year to buyers who drive them to California markets. The horses we sell year-round, working horses, breeding stock, occasional specialty animals. We're starting to build a reputation for quality." Eleanor listened as he outlined the ranch's operations, the careful balance of income and expenses, the challenges of weather and market prices, and the constant work required to keep everything running. Despite herself, she found it interesting. This was a complex operation, more like running a small business than simple farming. "The ranch hands?" she said. "Do any of them have families?" 3 do. They live in the cabins about a quarter-mile south of here. 2 have children, 5 kids total, ranging from 4 to 12 years old. "Who teaches them?" "Their mothers, mostly, when they have time," which isn't often. Caleb paused, watching her. "I'd hoped you might be willing to take that on. Your father said you were well-educated, good with reading and numbers. So you didn't just buy a wife. You bought a bookkeeper and schoolteacher as well." She'd meant it to sting, and saw from his slight wince that it had, but he didn't argue. "Yes," he said simply. "I suppose I did. Is that something you'd be willing to do?" Eleanor considered. Teaching children was something she'd actually enjoy, something that would give her days purpose beyond managing a household she'd never wanted. And bookkeeping, well, she'd always been good with numbers, had helped her mother manage their household accounts for years before Catherine died. "I'll teach the children," she said, "and I'll handle the books once you show me your current system. But I'm doing it because I choose to, because it's work worth doing, not because you purchased the right to demand it from me." "Understood." Caleb's voice was quiet. and appreciated. They finished the meal in relative silence, but it felt less oppressive than before. Eleanor cleared the plates, and when Caleb moved to help, she let him. They worked side by side at the wash basin, falling into an awkward rhythm. She washed, he dried, neither speaking but not quite comfortable with the quiet either. "I should show you where everything is," Caleb said when they'd finished. "For the morning. Coffee's kept here. Sarah usually leaves bread dough rising overnight in this covered bowl. Wood for the stove is in the box outside the back door." "You cook?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "Had to learn when I was on my own. I'm not fancy about it, but I can make a meal that won't poison anyone." He hung the dish towel on its hook. "Though I expect you're better at it than I am." "My mother taught me. She was from Boston, knew how to do things properly." Eleanor ran her fingers along the smooth counter. "She would have hated this. What happened to me?" "I imagine so." Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What was she like?" Eleanor glanced at him, surprised again. "Why do you want to know?" "Because she made you who you are. That seems worth knowing." The answer disarmed her. Eleanor found herself talking, telling him about Catherine Whitford, her intelligence, her strength, her insistence that Eleanor receive an education equal to any boy's. She talked about the books they'd read together, the discussions they'd had, the future her mother had imagined for her that didn't include being sold to settle debts. Caleb listened without interrupting, and when she finally stopped talking, he nodded slowly. "She sounds like a remarkable woman. I'm sorry you lost her." "So am I." Eleanor felt suddenly exhausted, wrung out by the day's emotions. "I should probably... It's been a long day." "Of course," Caleb straightened. "Take whatever time you need to settle in. I'll be up early. Ranch work starts at dawn. But you don't need to adjust your schedule right away. Take time to get your bearings." Eleanor nodded, then hesitated at the base of the stairs. "Caleb?" He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his given name. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the room, for not expecting things. I know you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." His voice was firm. "Maybe not legally, but morally. This situation is already forced enough. I won't make it worse by taking what should only be freely given." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and climbed the stairs to her room. Her own room, with a door that locked from the inside, in a house that was now supposed to be her home. She changed into her nightgown slowly, unpinned her hair, washed her face in the basin on the dresser. The bed was soft when she finally crawled into it, the quilts heavy and warm. Through the window she could see stars emerging in the darkening sky. This was her wedding night. She was married to a man she'd met 3 weeks ago, living in a house she'd never seen until today, bound to a future she hadn't chosen. Every part of her situation screamed wrong, unfair, unjust. And yet she was alone in her own room, unmolested, with a door that locked, and a husband who'd promised to wait for her consent. It was more than she'd dared hope for. Eleanor lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, trying to reconcile the reality of her situation with what she'd feared. Eventually, she heard Caleb's footsteps in the hallway, heard his door open and close at the far end of the house. The distance between their rooms felt both comforting and strange. Sleep came eventually, fitful and dream-plagued. But when she woke to dawn light streaming through unfamiliar windows, Eleanor was surprised to find she felt something other than despair. Not happiness, not contentment, but maybe, the faintest possibility that she could survive this. That survival might even, eventually, become something more. The smell of coffee drifted up from downstairs. Eleanor rose, dressed, braided her hair with fingers that had stopped trembling. Then she went down to face her first full day as Eleanor Monroe, unsure what it would bring, but determined to meet it standing. Caleb was already gone when Eleanor reached the kitchen. The coffee pot sat warming on the stove, a covered plate of biscuits beside it, and a note in his precise handwriting. Rode out to check the north fence line. Back by noon. Help yourself to anything you need. Eleanor poured coffee and stood at the window, watching the ranch come to life in the early morning light. Men moved between the barn and corrals, their voices carrying faintly across the distance. Horses whinnied. Somewhere a dog barked. It was a working place, purposeful and alive, and she was supposed to be part of it now. She spent the morning exploring the house more thoroughly than she'd managed the night before. The parlor held books. Not many, but carefully chosen volumes on ranching, animal husbandry, a few classics. The dining room had a china cabinet with dishes that looked like they'd come from somewhere far more civilized than the Oregon frontier. Upstairs, the back bedroom where Caleb slept was Spartan, a narrow bed, a trunk, a washstand. Nothing personal except a daguerreotype on the small table beside the bed. Eleanor picked it up, studying the image. A severe-looking couple stared back at her, the woman seated, the man standing with his hand on her shoulder. Behind them stood a younger Caleb, maybe 16 or 17, already tall but not yet filled out, his expression serious even then. "That's my parents," Caleb's voice came from the doorway. Eleanor startled, nearly dropping the frame. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I was just looking around." "That's fair. This is your house now, too." He stepped into the room, took the daguerreotype from her gently. "They died within 6 months of each other, 8 years ago. Fever. My father first, then my mother just gave up without him." "I'm sorry." Eleanor watched his face, saw the old grief there, carefully controlled. "Were you close?" "My father and I understood each other. We were both better with work than words. My mother wanted me to be softer, more sociable." He set the frame back on the table with care. "She'd have liked you, I think. Would have been glad I found someone educated, well-spoken." Found is a generous word for what happened. Caleb acknowledged that with a slight nod. "Fair enough. But she still would have liked you." He gestured toward the door. "I came back to see if you wanted to tour the ranch properly. Meet the hands, see the operation, unless you'd rather have more time to settle in." Eleanor considered. She could stay in the house, safe and separate from the ranch that now defined her life. Or she could face it head on, start learning what her role here actually meant. "I'll get my riding clothes," she said. 20 minutes later, she sat astride Belle. Caleb had brought her mare from her father's place that morning, without being asked, following him through the ranch. He rode a big bay gelding with the ease of someone who'd spent half his life in the saddle, pointing out features as they went. Main barn there holds about 30 horses plus tack and feed. Smaller barn beyond it is for sick animals or mares about to foal. Bunkhouse for the single hands. Those 3 cabins are family quarters. He gestured to each building in turn. Smokehouse, root cellar, workshop. We're mostly self-sufficient except for things we can't make ourselves. Coffee, sugar, fabric, tools. They rode past a large corral where 2 men were working with a young horse, teaching it to accept a saddle. Both stopped to stare as Caleb and Eleanor approached. "Eleanor, this is Jack and Pete. They've been with me for 5 years. Jack? Pete? My wife. Eleanor." The title still felt foreign, but Eleanor managed a nod. "Pleased to meet you." Jack, the older of the two, pulled his hat off. "Ma'am, welcome to Monroe Ranch." Pete just nodded, his eyes curious but not unfriendly. Eleanor could practically see the questions he wasn't asking, about how this marriage had come about. What kind of woman would marry Caleb Monroe this way, whether she'd last? They continued the tour. Caleb showed her the cattle pastures stretching toward distant hills, explained the rotation system he used to keep the grass healthy, pointed out the creek that provided year-round water. He talked about the ranch with quiet passion, and Eleanor found herself listening not just to the words but to what they revealed about him. This place was everything to him. His accomplishment, his purpose, his pride. "The family cabins are just ahead," Caleb said, angling his horse toward a cluster of small buildings. "I told Maria you'd be coming by. She's got 3 of the 5 children, and she's been hoping for someone to help with their schooling." A woman emerged from the nearest cabin as they approached, short and sturdy, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and a baby on her hip. 2 other children peered from behind her skirts, curious and shy. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, her accent marking her as Mexican. "Welcome. I am Maria Garcia. This is baby Rosa, and these 2 hiding are my sons, Miguel and Carlos. Please, call me Eleanor." She dismounted, approaching slowly so as not to frighten the children. "Your husband works here?" "Yes, Diego is foreman for the cattle crew. He is out with the herd today." Maria shifted the baby to her other hip. "Caleb says maybe you could teach the children their letters." "I can read a little, but writing—" She shook her head. Diego wants them to have more than we had. I'd be happy to teach them. Eleanor looked at the two boys, who were probably 7 and 9. Do you want to learn to read? The older one, Miguel, nodded eagerly. Papa says reading makes a man worth more. Says it opens doors. Your papa's right. Eleanor glanced at Caleb, who was watching the exchange with something that might have been approval. What if we started next week? I'll need a few days to organize lessons, gather materials. Maria's face lit up. That would be wonderful. The children will be so excited. She paused. If you need anything, Eleanor, anything at all, you come find me, yes? We women must help each other out here. The offer was clearly about more than household matters, and Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you. I will. They visited the other two family cabins, met the Henderson children, 2 girls aged 4 and 6, and the single young son of Tom and Sarah Miller, a boy of 12 named James, who was already working alongside his father. By the time they headed back toward the main house, Eleanor's head spun with names and faces and the sheer scope of what Caleb had built. You've created something impressive, she said as they rode side by side. This ranch? It's more than just land and cattle. It's a community. It has to be. Out here, people depend on each other. Caleb glanced at her. That includes you now. These families, they'll look to you for things they need. Doctoring sometimes when Sarah's not available. Help with disputes. Someone to talk to when things get hard. It's part of what being the rancher's wife means. Another job I didn't sign up for. No, but one you might find worthwhile anyway. Eleanor wanted to argue, to resent this additional expectation, but she couldn't quite manage it. The children she'd met today deserved education. Maria and the other women deserved support. It wasn't their fault Eleanor had been forced into this position. I'll do what I can, she said finally. But on my terms, Caleb, because it's right, not because I'm obligated. I wouldn't want it any other way. They spent the afternoon in Caleb's office, a small room off the parlor Eleanor hadn't explored yet, going through the ranch accounts. Caleb's bookkeeping was meticulous but basic, simple ledgers tracking income and expenses. Eleanor saw immediately how she could improve the system, create categories and projections that would help plan for future needs. You could be making more on the horse sales, she said, studying the numbers. These prices are too low for breeding stock this quality. Caleb looked up from the map he'd been annotating. You know horses? My mother's family bred them in Massachusetts. She taught me how to evaluate bloodlines, conformation, potential. Eleanor ran her finger down a column of figures. This mare you sold last month for $60? She should have brought at least 90, maybe 100. Her dam's line is known for endurance and temperament. How did you... Caleb came to stand beside her, looking at the entry she'd indicated. I didn't mention bloodlines in the ledger. You listed her dam and sire. I recognized the names from the breeding records I saw in the barn this morning. She glanced up at him. You have excellent stock, Caleb, but you're undervaluing it because you don't realize what you have. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to what looked like respect. Could you help me? Evaluate the breeding program, figure out what we should be asking? Eleanor hesitated. This would mean more involvement, deeper integration into ranch operations, but it would also mean doing something she actually knew and cared about, using skills her mother had given her. Yes, she said, I could do that. They worked until Sarah arrived to start supper, falling into a comfortable rhythm of questions and answers. Caleb explained his breeding goals. Eleanor pointed out bloodline strengths he'd overlooked. By the time they stopped, Eleanor had filled 3 pages with notes and recommendations. Sarah smiled when she saw them bent over the ledgers together. Good to see the office getting proper attention, she said. Caleb's brilliant with animals and land, but accounting makes his eyes cross. I can hear you, Caleb said mildly. I know, that's why I said it loud enough. Sarah winked at Eleanor. You staying for supper or heading home? Heading home. Tom will be wondering where I got to. She paused. But Eleanor, tomorrow morning I could show you the household accounts, the supply ordering, all of that. If you're ready. I'm ready. Eleanor surprised herself with how much she meant it. After Sarah left, Eleanor and Caleb prepared supper together, an easier process than the night before, with less awkwardness. They talked about the ranch, about the children's lessons Eleanor would start planning, about small practical matters that filled the silence without requiring emotional vulnerability. But as evening deepened and the time approached when they'd retire to their separate rooms, Eleanor felt the weight of unspoken things pressing down. They were living like business partners, like colleagues sharing a house, and while that was what Caleb had promised, it couldn't last forever. Eventually, the pretense would crack. Eventually, something would have to give. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed listening to distant sounds, wind in the eaves, a coyote calling from the hills, the low murmur of Caleb's voice as he spoke to one of the dogs that hung around the ranch. She thought about the day, about children who needed teaching, and horses that needed proper evaluation, and a man who kept his promises even when it cost him. She thought about choice and what it meant, and whether choosing to make the best of a bad situation was the same as accepting it. Sleep was pulling her under when she heard it, a sharp crack, then shouting. Eleanor bolted upright, heart pounding. More shouts, closer now, and the unmistakable sound of breaking wood. She scrambled out of bed, pulled a shawl over her nightgown, and ran into the hallway. Caleb's door was already open, his room empty. From downstairs came the sound of men's voices, angry and aggressive. Eleanor crept to the top of the stairs, staying in shadow. 4 men stood in the parlor, and none of them belonged there. 3 held rifles. The 4th, a tall man with a scarred face, held a lantern. They were ransacking the room, pulling open drawers, overturning furniture. "Where's the safe?" Scarface demanded. "We know Monroe keeps cash here." "Ain't found nothing yet," one of the others replied. "Maybe it's upstairs." Eleanor's blood went cold. If they came upstairs, they'd find her. And 4 armed men finding a woman alone in her nightclothes. She knew exactly how that would end. Where was Caleb? Had they already hurt him? Killed him? The thought sent a spike of pure terror through her chest. She'd spent 2 days resenting this marriage, maintaining careful emotional distance, refusing to let herself care about the man who'd bought her like property. But the idea of him lying dead somewhere, of being truly alone with these violent strangers, revealed a truth she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. She didn't want him dead, didn't want to be alone. Had perhaps already started to feel something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't pure resentment either. One of the men started toward the stairs. Eleanor backed up silently, her mind racing. Caleb's room. There had been a rifle above the door. She'd noticed it that morning when she'd been snooping. She moved quickly, grabbed the rifle, checked it with hands that barely shook, loaded. Her father had taught her to shoot, and her mother had insisted she learn to do it well. "A woman needs to protect herself," Catherine had said, and Eleanor had never been more grateful for that lesson. The floorboard creaked under her foot, loud in the night silence. "Someone's upstairs," one of the men called out. Eleanor had seconds to decide. Hide and hope they didn't find her, or confront them, armed but outnumbered. She thought of Caleb, somewhere out there, maybe hurt. She thought of the families in those cabins, depending on this ranch for their livelihoods. She thought of her mother's voice. "You're stronger than you know, Eleanor." Eleanor stepped to the top of the stairs, rifle raised and steady. "Get out of this house." The 4 men froze, staring up at her. Then Scarface laughed. "Well now, Monroe got himself a pretty little wife. Drop the rifle, sweetheart, before you hurt yourself." "I know how to use it, and I'll shoot the first man who takes another step." "She's bluffing," another man said, but he didn't move forward. "Am I?" Eleanor cocked the rifle, the sound sharp and unmistakable. "Try me." Scarface's expression hardened. "We came for what Monroe owes. Either he pays up, or we take payment in goods, including his wife, if she don't learn to keep her mouth shut. Caleb doesn't owe you anything. You're thieves and cowards, 4 armed men against a sleeping household." Eleanor kept the rifle trained on Scarface's chest. "Last chance. Leave now, or I start shooting." "You won't!" Eleanor fired. The bullet splintered the doorframe 6 inches from Scarface's head. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. "Next one goes through your skull," she said calmly, though her ears rang and her heart hammered. "Your choice." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Scarface swore viciously. "This ain't over. Monroe's going to pay for this." "If Monroe were here, you'd already be dead," Eleanor said. "He's a better shot than I am, and he wouldn't have missed intentionally. So count yourselves lucky and get out." The men backed toward the door, rifles still raised, clearly unwilling to turn their backs on her. Eleanor followed them down the stairs, keeping her weapon trained on them. When they finally stumbled out into the night, she slammed the door and threw the heavy bolt. Only then did her hands start to shake. She set the rifle down carefully, leaned against the door, and let out a breath that was half sob. She'd just held off 4 armed men. She'd fired a weapon in anger for the first time in her life. She'd defended a house she'd lived in for barely 2 days like it was worth dying for. And Caleb was still out there somewhere. Eleanor grabbed a lantern and the rifle and went out through the kitchen door. The ranch yard was dark and silent, no sign of the intruders or anyone else. She called out softly, "Caleb?" No answer. She moved toward the barn, pulse pounding. What if they'd already killed him? What if she was too late? "Eleanor?" The voice came from behind her. She spun, rifle raised, then nearly dropped it when she saw Caleb emerging from the shadows near the smokehouse. Blood ran down the side of his face from a cut above his eye, and he moved stiffly, favoring his left side. "You're hurt." Eleanor closed the distance between them, set down the rifle so she could examine his face. "What happened?" "They jumped me when I went to check on a noise near the barn. 4 of them. Knocked me out before I could get my gun." He caught her wrist gently. "Eleanor, there were 4 armed men. I know, I sent them away." Caleb stared at her. "You what?" "They broke into the house. I got your rifle, held them off, fired a warning shot. They left." She said it matter-of-factly, but her voice shook slightly. "You could have been killed. If they'd called your bluff." "It wasn't a bluff. I would have shot them." Eleanor met his eyes. "This is my house now, my home. I wasn't going to let them destroy it or hurt the people who depend on it." Something profound shifted in Caleb's expression. He reached up, cupped her face in his calloused hand. "You're bleeding," he said softly. Eleanor touched her cheek, found blood there from a splinter that must have caught her when she fired. She hadn't even felt it. "So are you," she said. They stood in the darkness, both bleeding, both shaking slightly from violence and adrenaline, looking at each other like strangers who'd suddenly become something else entirely. "We should get inside," Caleb said finally. "Clean these wounds. I need to ride to Tom's place, get the men together in case those 4 come back." But he didn't move, and neither did Eleanor. They stayed there in the night, hands still touching, something unspoken but powerful stretching between them. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, "for defending our home, for being braver than you needed to be." It wasn't bravery. It was necessity. But even as she said it, Eleanor knew it was more than that. Somewhere in the past 2 days, this place had started to become hers, not because she'd been bought and paid for, but because she'd chosen to fight for it. Choice. Real choice. Made in a moment of crisis when she could have hidden, could have let the ranch burn and called it justice for what had been done to her. But she hadn't. She'd stood her ground, defended what was hers, and discovered in the process that she was stronger than she'd known. Caleb seemed to see the realization dawning in her eyes. His thumb brushed gently across her cheekbone, careful of the small cut there. "Come inside," he said. "Let me clean that wound, then we'll figure out what comes next." Eleanor nodded, suddenly exhausted but also strangely exhilarated. They walked back to the house together, and when Caleb offered his arm, she took it. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Inside, Caleb lit lamps while Eleanor pumped water. They worked in silence, but it was a different silence than before, charged with awareness, with the knowledge that something fundamental had changed between them. "Sit," Eleanor ordered, pulling a chair out from the table. She dampened a cloth, began cleaning the blood from Caleb's face with gentle efficiency. The cut above his eye wasn't deep but would bruise badly. His lip was split, and she suspected he had cracked ribs from the way he held himself. "You should see Sarah in the morning," she said. "She'll know if those ribs need binding. I've had worse." But he didn't pull away from her ministrations. His eyes stayed on her face as she worked, dark and intense. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My mother insisted. She said a woman on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself." Eleanor rinsed the cloth, wrung it out. "I never thought I'd actually need to." You did more than protect yourself. You protected all of us. Caleb caught her hand. Eleanor, what you did tonight, holding off 4 armed men, most men wouldn't have that kind of courage. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. His grip tightened slightly. You could have hidden, could have let them take whatever they wanted. Instead, you stood between them and our home. He stopped, seemed to struggle for words. That's everything I hoped you might be when I agreed to this arrangement. Eleanor pulled her hand back gently, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity in his gaze. Don't make me into something I'm not. I did what had to be done, that's all. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Caleb stood, moved to the sink to wet a clean cloth. Your turn. Let me see that cut. Eleanor sat, tilted her face up as he'd done. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, work-roughened hands. The cloth was cool against her heated skin as he cleaned away the blood. It's barely a scratch, he murmured. You'll have a small scar, maybe, but nothing serious. Battle scars from my first real fight. Eleanor tried to make it sound light, but her voice came out shaky. Caleb set the cloth aside, but didn't step back. He stood close, one hand still resting against her jaw, and Eleanor found she couldn't look away from his eyes. I need to ask you something, he said quietly, and I need you to answer honestly. All right. When you defended this house tonight, was it just about survival, about protecting yourself from those men, or was it something more? Eleanor's breath caught. She knew what he was really asking. Was she starting to see this place, this marriage, as something worth fighting for? Or had she simply been protecting her own skin in the only way available? I don't know, she admitted. When I heard them downstairs, my first thought was to hide. But then I heard them talking about coming upstairs, and I thought about you being hurt somewhere, and the families who depend on this ranch, and I couldn't let them destroy it. I couldn't let them win. Couldn't let them win, Caleb repeated softly. That sounds like you've started to care. Maybe I have. Maybe despite everything, despite how wrong this all started, I've started to feel like this place matters. Eleanor's eyes burned with unshed tears. But that doesn't make what happened to me right. It doesn't mean I forgive being sold like property. I know. Caleb's thumb brushed her cheekbone again, achingly tender. And I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm glad you're starting to feel like this could be home. That's more than I dared hope for. They stayed like that for a long moment, the kitchen quiet around them except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Eleanor was acutely aware of every point where their bodies almost touched. His hand against her face, his chest inches from her shoulder, the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. I should ride to Tom's, Caleb said finally, but he didn't move. Yes, Eleanor agreed. In case those men come back? Yes. Neither moved. Then Caleb pulled back with what looked like physical effort, stepping away to create distance between them. I'll be back before dawn. Lock the doors behind me. If you hear anything, I still have the rifle. Eleanor stood, wrapping her shawl tighter around herself. I'll be fine. I know you will. He collected his hat, his own rifle from where it hung by the door. At the threshold, he paused. Eleanor, what you did tonight, I won't forget it, ever. Then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone in the house she'd defended like it was worth dying for. She locked the door, checked all the windows, then carried the rifle upstairs to her room. But she didn't undress or try to sleep. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the dark shapes of the ranch buildings, rifle across her lap, waiting for Caleb to return, and realized, with a jolt that went through her whole body, that she wasn't just waiting to know the ranch was secure. She was waiting because she needed to see him safe, needed to know those men hadn't caught him on the road, needed the confirmation that he was alive and whole. When had that happened? When had Caleb Monroe become someone she cared about protecting, instead of just the man who'd bought her? Eleanor didn't have an answer, but she knew something had fundamentally changed tonight. She'd defended their home, and she'd thought of it as theirs, not his. She'd stood her ground not because she was forced to, but because she chose to. For the first time since that terrible letter had arrived, Eleanor had made a real choice, and she'd chosen to fight for the life that had been forced upon her, to claim it as her own instead of just enduring it. The realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Dawn was breaking when Eleanor finally saw riders approaching, Caleb and Tom, followed by 4 other ranch hands, all armed. She watched from the window as they circled the property, checking for signs of the intruders, before Caleb finally dismounted and headed toward the house. Eleanor met him at the door, rifle still in hand, though her arms ached from holding it ready all night. "They're gone," Caleb said, taking in her vigilant posture with an expression that held both concern and something warmer. "Tom's posting guards for the next few nights, but I don't think they'll be back. Cowards like that prefer easy targets, and you proved this house isn't one." "You should rest," Eleanor said, noticing the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. "Those ribs will keep until I've seen to the stock." But he swayed slightly as he said it, and Eleanor made a decision. "No. You'll see Sarah first, then you'll rest. Tom can handle the morning work." She set the rifle aside and took his arm with a firmness that surprised them both. "Don't argue with me, Caleb Monroe. I just spent all night defending this ranch. I'm not about to lose its owner to stubborn pride." A slow smile crossed his face, transforming the stern features into something almost boyish. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah arrived within the hour, took one look at Caleb's battered face and the way he held his side, and shooed Eleanor out of the room with instructions to make willow bark tea. Eleanor heard Sarah's scolding through the door as she worked at the stove. "Cracked ribs, just as I thought. You're lucky it's not worse, riding around in the dark with those barely healed wounds from yesterday. And don't give me that look. Eleanor was right to call me. Someone needs to keep you from working yourself into an early grave." Eleanor brought the tea up to find Caleb stripped to the waist, his torso wrapped in tight binding, a spectacular bruise already blooming across his left side. Sarah was packing her supplies, shaking her head. "He's to rest today. Actually rest, not rest while doing account work or planning next week's cattle drive." Sarah directed this at Eleanor. "You make sure he stays in bed, you hear?" "I'll do my best." After Sarah left, Eleanor stood awkwardly in the doorway of Caleb's small room, unsure of the protocols. They'd maintained such careful distance these past days, and now here he was, half-dressed and vulnerable, needing care she wasn't sure she should provide. "You don't have to stay," Caleb said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'll be fine. You'll be stubborn and ignore Sarah's orders the moment I leave." Eleanor moved into the room, set the tea on his bedside table. "Drink this. It'll help with the pain." He obeyed, making a face at the bitter taste. "You make terrible tea. You make terrible decisions. We all have our flaws." Eleanor pulled the room's single chair closer to the bed. "I'm staying until I'm sure you'll actually rest." "Eleanor, don't argue. You're injured because you were protecting this ranch. The least I can do is make sure you heal properly." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then leaned back against the pillows with a slight wince. "You've changed." "Have I?" "The woman who arrived here 3 days ago would have been happy to let me suffer, might have even enjoyed it after what my proposal cost you." Eleanor couldn't deny that. "Maybe defending your house at gunpoint changed my perspective." "Our house," Caleb corrected quietly. "You called it our house last night, I noticed." Heat crept up Eleanor's neck. She had said that, hadn't she? In the heat of the moment, with adrenaline pumping and fear making her reckless, she'd claimed ownership of this place she'd resented just days before. "Things said under duress don't count," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "Don't they?" Caleb's eyes were intent on her face. "I think they count most of all. When we're afraid, when everything's stripped away, that's when the truth comes out." "And what truth is that?" "That you're starting to feel like you belong here. That this isn't just a prison you're enduring, but a place you're willing to fight for." He paused. "That maybe you're starting to feel something for me beyond resentment." Eleanor's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to retreat behind the walls she'd so carefully constructed. But sitting here in the morning light, looking at this man who'd been beaten trying to protect his ranch, who'd kept every promise he'd made to her, who'd given her space and respect and time when he could have demanded so much more, she couldn't quite manage the lie. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "Everything's happened so fast. 2 weeks ago, I learned I'd been sold to settle my father's debts. A week ago, I married a stranger. 3 days ago, I moved into a house I'd never seen, and last night I shot at men to defend it all. I haven't had time to understand what any of it means. That's fair. Caleb's voice was gentle. I'm not asking you to have answers, Eleanor. I just want you to know that what you did last night, it meant something to me. You could have run, could have saved yourself and left the ranch to burn. Instead, you stood your ground. That's not the action of someone who doesn't care. Maybe I was just protecting myself. Those men would have found me eventually. Maybe, but I don't think that's all it was. He shifted slightly, winced at the movement. I've been watching you these past days. The way you talk to the children, the interest you take in the horses, how you've already started improving the account systems. You're not just going through motions. You're building something here. Eleanor looked away, uncomfortable with how clearly he saw her. You're reading too much into practical necessity. Am I? Caleb reached out, caught her hand before she could pull away. His palm was warm, calloused from work. Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it, even if you're not ready to believe it yet. Caleb, I knew who you were before your father came to me with his debts. Eleanor's head snapped up. What? I'd seen you in town 3 times over the past year, once at the general store, buying books, once at the church social last summer, once at the horse auction, where you were examining bloodlines with more knowledge than any of the men there. His thumb moved gently across her knuckles. Each time, I was struck by you. Your intelligence, your composure, the way you moved through the world like you belonged in it. You never spoke to me. No, I'm not good with words, never have been. And I figured a woman like you, educated, refined, wouldn't have interest in a rough rancher who's better with horses than people. He smiled slightly. So I admired from a distance and told myself it didn't matter. Eleanor's heart was pounding. Then my father came to you. Then your father came to me, desperate and half-drunk, with a debt he couldn't pay and a daughter he was terrified of losing to worse men than me. Caleb's grip tightened. James Corrigan had already made it clear he'd take you as payment if cash wasn't forthcoming. Your father knew what that meant. Knew Corrigan would sell you to the highest bidder, likely someone heading to California who'd work you to death, or worse. The room seemed to tilt. My father told me none of this? No, I imagine he didn't. Easier to let you think he simply gambled you away than to admit he was trying to save you from a worse fate. Caleb's voice was steady, matter of fact. I told him I'd pay his debts and marry you properly, legal and recognized, that you'd have a home, protection, a position in the community. It was the best option available. Best option, Eleanor repeated numbly. You mean least terrible option. Yes. He didn't sugarcoat it. And I won't pretend I did it purely from altruism. I wanted you, Eleanor, had wanted you since the first time I saw you examining those books like they held the secrets of the universe. When the opportunity arose to make you mine, even through such an ugly arrangement, I took it. Eleanor pulled her hand free, stood abruptly. The room felt too small, the air too thin. So this whole time, the respect, the separate rooms, the promises to wait for my choice, all of it was manipulation? A way to make me grateful so I'd eventually give you what you wanted? No. Caleb sat up despite the obvious pain it caused, his eyes fierce. Every promise I made you was genuine. Yes, I want this to become a real marriage eventually. Yes, I hope you'll choose me freely. But I meant what I said about waiting, about earning your trust. The fact that I wanted you from the beginning doesn't make those promises less true. How am I supposed to believe that? How am I supposed to trust anything you say when you've been keeping this from me? Because I'm telling you now, when I could have kept it secret forever. Caleb's voice was rough with intensity. Because I'm giving you the truth, even though I know it might make you hate me. That's how you know I mean it, Eleanor. I'm not hiding anymore. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process this new information. Caleb had wanted her before any of this began. Had noticed her, admired her, desired her. The arranged marriage hadn't been a cold business transaction for him. It had been an opportunity to claim a woman he'd coveted from afar. Should that make it better or worse? She didn't know. Didn't. I need air, she said abruptly. I need to think. Eleanor? Don't. Just stay here and rest like Sarah ordered. I'll be back later. She fled before he could respond, down the stairs and out into the morning sunshine that felt harsh after the dimness of his room. Her hands shook as she saddled Belle, her thoughts a chaotic tangle of anger and confusion, and something else she didn't want to name. Eleanor rode without direction, letting Belle choose the path through meadows still wet with dew. The physical action of riding helped calm the turmoil in her chest, let her start to sort through what Caleb had revealed. He'd wanted her, had seen her and desired her, and taken advantage of her father's desperation to make her his. That was manipulation, wasn't it? Using her desperate circumstances to acquire something he wanted? But he'd also saved her from Corrigan, from being sold to someone who'd treat her as disposable property. He'd given her protection, position, respect. He'd kept his promises about her autonomy even when it must have cost him. And he told her the truth now, when he could have kept her ignorant forever. Eleanor thought about the past 3 days, about Caleb's careful distance and respectful manner, about how he'd shown her the ranch, introduced her to the families, given her meaningful work with the accounts and the children's education, about how he'd praised her courage after she defended their home, had looked at her with such open admiration that it had made her uncomfortable. He'd been courting her, she realized. In his own awkward, practical way, he'd been trying to win her over, not by force or manipulation, but by demonstrating his character through action. Belle had carried her to the creek that marked the northern boundary of ranch property. Eleanor dismounted, let the mare drink while she sat on a sun-warm boulder and tried to untangle her feelings. She was angry that Caleb had kept this from her, angry that her father had lied about the circumstances, angry that even the small amount of control she thought she'd had, the belief that this marriage was equally unwanted by both parties, had been an illusion. But underneath the anger was something else. A small, traitorous flutter of warmth at the thought that Caleb had noticed her, had admired her intelligence and bearing, had wanted her not despite who she was, but because of it. No one had ever wanted her that way before. The few men who'd shown interest in her back home had been after her father's land or her mother's Boston connections. None had looked at her the way Caleb did, like she was valuable in herself, like her mind and strength mattered as much as her face. "I'm being foolish," Eleanor said aloud to Belle, who flicked an ear but otherwise ignored her. "He still bought me. The fact that he wanted to buy me doesn't make it less wrong. But it did make it different. Intent mattered. Caleb hadn't acquired a wife the way he'd acquire a breeding mare or a piece of equipment. He'd acquired a woman he'd admired from afar, and then he'd tried to make the forced situation as bearable as possible for her. That didn't make it right, but it made it complicated in ways Eleanor hadn't expected. She stayed by the creek until the sun was high, thinking through everything she knew about Caleb Monroe. His honesty, even when it cost him, his fair treatment of his workers, the way he'd built this ranch from nothing through sheer determination, his gentleness with the horses, his patience with her anger, his willingness to wait for something he desperately wanted because taking it by force would violate his principles. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd discovered she could be in moments of crisis. Someone brave enough to face down armed men, someone capable enough to improve ranch operations, someone strong enough to defend what mattered, even when what mattered had been forced upon her against her will. When Eleanor finally rode back to the ranch house, the sun had passed its zenith and she was exhausted but clearer-headed. She found Caleb where she'd left him, still in bed though clearly restless with forced inactivity. He looked up as she entered, wariness and hope warring in his expression. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said without preamble. "I can see that." Caleb's voice was careful, controlled. "Have you decided to hate me?" "I've decided that hate requires more energy than I have to spare." Eleanor sat in the chair she'd abandoned hours ago. "What you did, keeping the truth from me, that was wrong. I deserve to know the full circumstances." "You did. I'm sorry. But I also understand why you did it. You were trying to make an impossible situation bearable, and you thought the truth would make it worse." She met his eyes directly. "Were you right? Would knowing you'd wanted me from the start have made these past days easier or harder?" Caleb considered that seriously. "Harder, probably. You would have seen everything I did as manipulation, strategy, to get what I wanted, instead of just trying to be decent." "Yes." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "So I understand the choice you made, even if I don't like it. And I appreciate that you told me now, before things went further, before you made choices you couldn't take back, Caleb said quietly. Yes. They sat in silence for a moment, then Caleb asked, "What now?" Now we're honest with each other. Completely honest, no more secrets. If this marriage is going to work, if I'm going to truly choose it instead of just enduring it, I need to know I can trust what you tell me. You can. You have my word. I'm choosing to believe that. Eleanor stood, moved to the window. Outside, ranch hands moved between buildings, going about the daily work that kept this place running. I'm also choosing to stay, Caleb, not because I'm trapped, but because I want to. Because last night I realized that this place matters to me, that the work here is meaningful, that the people depend on us, that I'm building something worth protecting. She heard him move, felt him come to stand behind her. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "And what about me?" he asked, voice low. "Do I matter to you, Eleanor? Or just the ranch and the work?" Eleanor closed her eyes. This was the question, wasn't it? The one she'd been avoiding all day. She could lie, could keep herself safe behind walls of careful indifference. Or she could be as honest as she was demanding he be. "You matter," she said finally. "I don't know how much yet, or in what way. But when I thought those men might have killed you last night, I was terrified. Not just of being alone, but of losing you specifically. Of never getting the chance to know you better, to see where this could go." Caleb's breath caught. His hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder. "Can I touch you? Really touch you? Not just this careful distance we've been maintaining?" Eleanor's heart pounded. This was choice, real choice, the kind Caleb had promised to wait for. She could say no, could maintain the safe boundaries they'd established. Or she could take a risk, could reach for something that terrified and tempted her in equal measure. She turned to face him. His eyes were dark, intense, burning with want carefully held in check. Without the careful control he'd maintained these past days, she could see the desire there, the longing he'd been hiding. It should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel powerful. "Yes," she said. "You can touch me." Caleb's hand came up slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away. When she didn't, his palm cupped her cheek with aching tenderness. His thumb traced the small cut from last night's splinter, barely healed. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, "and so much stronger than you know. When I saw you at the top of those stairs with my rifle, ready to defend our home, I've never wanted anyone more in my life." "Wanted," Eleanor repeated. "Is that all this is? Physical desire?" "No." Caleb's other hand came up to frame her face, tilting it toward his. "It started with wanting, but these past days, watching you engage with the work, with the people, seeing your mind work through problems, it's become so much more. You're everything I hoped you'd be and things I didn't know enough to hope for." Eleanor's hands came to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the thin fabric of his shirt. "I'm still angry, you know, about being sold, about not having a choice in the beginning. That anger doesn't just disappear because you're being sweet now." "I know, I'm not asking it to." Caleb's forehead touched hers. "I'm just asking for a chance, to court you properly, to earn what was taken from you, to make you glad you chose to stay. You're already courting me. The respect, the meaningful work, the space to breathe, that's all courtship." "Is it working?" Eleanor looked up at him, at this complicated man who'd bought her in desperation and desire, who'd kept his word even when it cost him, who'd built something meaningful from nothing and now wanted to share it with her. "Yes," she admitted, "it's working." Caleb's smile was slow and genuine, transforming his stern features. "Then can I kiss you? Not because I'm owed it, not because we're married, but because you want me to." It was the question Eleanor had been both dreading and hoping for, the final surrender of the distance she'd been maintaining. But standing here in his arms, feeling the warmth of him, seeing the careful hope in his eyes, she realized the distance had already closed. She'd already chosen him, had chosen this marriage when she'd defended their home with a rifle in her hands. This was just acknowledging what her actions had already declared. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Kiss me." Caleb's mouth met hers gently, carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. Eleanor's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer despite the knowledge that his ribs were cracked, that this should hurt him. But he made a sound low in his throat that wasn't pain, and his arms came around her, solid and sure. The kiss deepened. Eleanor had been kissed before. Awkward experiments with boys back home, fumbling and meaningless. This was different. This was heat and promise and the feeling of coming home to a place she'd never been. Caleb kissed her like he'd been starving for it, like she was water in a drought, and Eleanor found herself responding with equal hunger. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers again. "I love you," he said quietly. "I probably have since that first time I saw you at the bookstore, looking at those books like they were treasures. I know you're not ready to say it back, might never be ready, but I needed you to know. This isn't just want or convenience for me, Eleanor. It's love." Eleanor's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. "You can't love me. You barely know me." "I know enough, and I'll spend the rest of our lives learning more if you'll let me." "This is insane. We've been married 3 days. And in those 3 days, you've proven yourself braver, smarter, and stronger than anyone I've ever met. That's enough to build a lifetime on." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that love required more than 3 days and shared danger. But looking at Caleb's face, seeing the absolute certainty there, she couldn't quite manage it. "I don't love you yet," she said instead, needing him to understand. "I like you, admire you, want you. But love takes time. Takes trust that I'm still building." "I know, and I'll wait." Caleb's smile was soft. "I'm good at waiting, Eleanor. I waited a year for an opportunity to make you mine. I can wait however long it takes for you to love me back." "You're assuming I will." "I'm hoping you will. There's a difference." Eleanor shook her head, but she was smiling despite herself. "You're infuriating." "You're magnificent." He kissed her again, brief and sweet. "And I promise, every single day, I'll work to earn what you're choosing to give me." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah's voice called from downstairs. "Eleanor, I brought more willow bark tea and some food. Figured you two might be hungry." Eleanor stepped back from Caleb's embrace, suddenly self-conscious. "We should go down." "In a minute." Caleb caught her hand. "Eleanor, I need to know. Are we really doing this? Building a marriage, not just enduring an arrangement?" Eleanor thought about the question, about everything that had happened in 3 short, transformative days. About the woman she'd been when she arrived here. Angry, frightened, convinced her life was over. About the woman she'd become. Someone who could face down armed men, who could defend what mattered, who could choose bravery even when terrified. She thought about Caleb, who'd wanted her and respected her in equal measure. Who'd given her space to find her footing, who'd kept his word even when it would have been easier not to, who looked at her like she hung the moon. "Yes," she said, "we're building a marriage, a real one, based on choice and respect and, eventually, love." Caleb's answering smile was worth every moment of fear and anger that had brought her here. He kissed her knuckles, old-fashioned and courtly. "Then let's go down and eat. I'm starving, and Sarah will scold if we keep her waiting." They went downstairs hand in hand, and when Sarah saw them together, saw the change in how they stood, how they looked at each other, her face broke into a knowing smile. "Well now," she said, "looks like something good came out of last night's trouble after all." Eleanor felt herself blush, but didn't pull away from Caleb's hand. "We've reached an understanding." "I can see that. About time, too." Sarah set out food on the table, fresh bread, cold chicken, cheese, apples from the root cellar. "Tom's got the men organized for night watches. Those thieves won't be back, but better safe than sorry." They ate together, Sarah keeping up a steady stream of ranch news that required no response. Eleanor found herself relaxing, the tension of the past days slowly unwinding. This felt right, sitting at this table with Caleb beside her, planning for their shared future, building something real from the ashes of a forced beginning. After Sarah left, Caleb turned to Eleanor. "You should rest. You were up all night." "So were you." "Yes, but I'm under doctor's orders to stay in bed anyway. You've been riding around the countryside working through your feelings. He stood, pulled her to her feet. Come on, I'll tuck you in. Caleb Monroe, are you trying to get me into bed? His eyes darkened with heat, but his voice stayed gentle. Only to sleep. We're building this right, remember? That means not rushing the physical parts just because we're legally married. Eleanor appreciated that more than she could say. Thank you for understanding that I need time. I understand that you need choice, real choice, not just words. He walked her upstairs to her room, waited while she changed into a nightgown behind the screen. When she emerged, he'd turned down the bed, pulled the curtains. Sleep, he ordered. I'll wake you for supper. Eleanor climbed into bed, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. The events of the past days crashed over her. The wedding, the tour of the ranch, the attack, the revelation of Caleb's feelings, the decision to truly choose this marriage. It was too much to process while standing. Caleb bent and kissed her forehead. Rest well, my brave wife. Caleb? Eleanor caught his hand before he could leave. I may not love you yet, but I'm glad I'm here. Glad I'm yours. His smile could have lit the darkness. That's more than enough for now. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor lay in the dimness, her mind still churning but her body demanding rest. Through the window she could see the ranch spreading out below, the buildings, the pastures, the families she was responsible for now. Her ranch, her home, her choice. And somewhere in this house, her husband, a man she was learning to trust, learning to want, learning to see as partner rather than purchaser. It wasn't the life Eleanor would have chosen freely, but it was becoming the life she wanted to build. And that was a kind of freedom all its own. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of children's laughter. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't place where she was or why sunlight streamed through unfamiliar windows at the wrong angle. Then memory flooded back. The ranch, the marriage, the choice she'd made to stop merely surviving and start truly living. She dressed quickly and followed the sounds downstairs. In the kitchen, she found Caleb at the table with Maria's two boys, Miguel and Carlos, spread out with slates and chalk between them. Caleb was attempting to demonstrate letter formation, his large hands awkward with the small chalk, while the boys watched with barely suppressed giggles. That's not an A, Miguel said diplomatically. That's more like a triangle with a line through it. It's close enough, Caleb protested, then looked up to see Eleanor in the doorway. His face transformed with a smile that made her heart skip. There you are. I was starting to think you'd sleep until tomorrow. What time is it? Nearly noon. You needed the rest. He stood, awkward with the boys watching. Maria brought the children over for their first lesson, but I told her you were sleeping. Thought I'd keep them occupied until you woke. Eleanor moved into the kitchen, noticed the coffee Caleb had already poured for her, the plate of food kept warm on the stove. Small gestures of care that he offered without fanfare, as natural as breathing. Let me see what you've been teaching them, she said, picking up Miguel's slate. The letters were wobbly but recognizable, evidence that Caleb had been trying despite his admitted discomfort with teaching. This is good work. Both of you are doing well. The boys beamed. Carlos, the younger one, tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. Mama says you're going to teach us to read real books. Is that true? It's true. We'll start with the alphabet, then simple words, and before you know it, you'll be reading stories. Stories about what? Eleanor thought about the books upstairs, the volumes her mother had treasured and taught her from. About brave knights and clever princesses. About people who go on adventures and solve problems. About anything you can imagine. Miguel's eyes went wide. Anything? Anything at all. That's the magic of reading. It takes you places you've never been and shows you things you've never seen. Caleb watched this exchange with an expression Eleanor was learning to recognize. Pride mixed with something deeper, warmer. When she glanced at him, he didn't look away or hide what he felt. The honesty of it still unnerved her, but in a way that felt less threatening than it had days ago. Maria arrived to collect the boys an hour later, after Eleanor had worked through basic letter recognition with them. Thank you, she said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. This means everything to Diego and me. We want them to have opportunities we never did. They're bright children. It'll be my pleasure to teach them. Eleanor walked Maria to the door, then added quietly, "And thank you for the offer of friendship. It's helped, knowing I have women here who understand." "We take care of our own," Maria said simply. "You're one of us now, Eleanor. Don't forget that." After they left, Eleanor found Caleb in the barn, checking on a mare that was close to foaling. He moved carefully, his cracked ribs clearly still painful, but his hands on the horse were gentle and sure. "You should be resting," Eleanor said. "So should you, according to Sarah's timeline. But here we both are." He ran his hand along the mare's side, feeling for the foal's position. "She'll go tonight or tomorrow, I think. Want to stay and watch when it happens?" "I've never seen a birth before. It's messy and miraculous. Reminds you what we're doing all this work for. New life, new possibilities." He glanced at her. "How are you feeling? After yesterday? After everything?" Eleanor leaned against the stall door, considering. "Strange. Like I'm watching my own life from outside, seeing someone who looks like me but acts braver than I feel. That's what bravery is, though, acting despite the fear." Caleb gave the mare a final pat and joined Eleanor at the stall door. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Eleanor. We're building something here, but it doesn't have to be built in a day. Everyone keeps saying that, Sarah, Maria, you, as if time will magically make everything clear. Not magic, just the steady work of getting to know each other, building trust." He reached for her hand, a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Speaking of which, I need to ride out to the south pasture this afternoon. Check on the cattle herd. Want to come with me?" Eleanor had account work waiting, lesson plans to develop, a dozen household tasks Sarah had mentioned. But the thought of riding out across open land with Caleb, of seeing more of this ranch that was becoming hers, appealed to something restless in her chest. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." They rode out an hour later, following trails that wound through meadows golden with late spring flowers. Caleb pointed out landmarks, explained the boundaries of Monroe land, talked about his plans for expansion. Eleanor listened, asked questions, and felt herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride and the easy conversation. "That ridge there," Caleb said, pointing to a distant line of hills. "That's where I want to build a line cabin, somewhere the hands can shelter during winter roundup, store supplies. We lose too many cattle in harsh weather because there's no protection out here." "That makes sense. Have you drawn up plans?" "Not yet. I'm better with the doing than the planning." He smiled ruefully. "That's where you come in. You've got the mind for organization, for thinking ahead." "So I'm not just a teacher and bookkeeper. Now I'm a building planner too?" "Partner," Caleb corrected. "Partners do whatever needs doing." "And I've seen how your mind works, Eleanor. You see solutions I'd never think of." They crested a rise and the land opened up before them, hundreds of acres of grazing land dotted with cattle, mountains rising in the distance, sky so blue it hurt to look at. Eleanor had seen beautiful vistas before, had traveled through spectacular country on the journey west with her parents years ago. But this felt different. This was hers to protect, to nurture, to build upon. "It's overwhelming sometimes," Caleb said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "The responsibility of it all. Every animal, every person who depends on this ranch, they're all counting on me to make the right decisions." "On us," Eleanor corrected. "You're not alone in this anymore." Something fierce and grateful flashed in Caleb's eyes. "No, I'm not. Am I?" They found the cattle herd spread across a wide meadow, contentedly grazing. Caleb rode among them with practiced ease, checking for illness or injury, counting heads against his mental inventory. Eleanor watched him work, saw how the cattle responded to his calm presence, how he moved through them without causing fear or disruption. "You're good with them," she observed when he returned. "Cattle are simple. Treat them fair, meet their needs, they give you their trust." He paused. "People are harder, more complicated." "Are you saying you understand cattle better than you understand me?" "I'm saying cattle don't have every right to mistrust me. Cattle don't have to overcome being purchased against their will." Caleb's voice was serious. "You're complicated, Eleanor, and rightly so. I don't pretend to understand everything you feel, but I'm trying to learn." Eleanor guided Belle closer to Caleb's gelding. "You're doing better than you think. The separate rooms, the meaningful work, the honesty about your feelings, it all matters. It's helping. Helping you trust me? Helping me trust myself. Trust that choosing to stay here, choosing to build this marriage, that it's not weakness or surrender, that it's strength. Caleb reached across the space between their horses, caught her hand. It's the strongest thing I've ever seen anyone do. Taking something forced upon you and making it yours by choice, that takes courage I can barely comprehend. They sat like that for a moment, hands linked between the horses, the vast Oregon landscape spreading around them. Then Caleb squeezed her fingers gently and released her. We should head back. Sarah will worry if we're gone too long, and my ribs are starting to complain about all this riding. The ride home was slower, companionable. They talked about small things, the children's lessons, improvements to the barn, what crops to plant in the kitchen garden. Normal conversation between partners planning a shared future. Eleanor found herself contributing ideas easily, no longer holding back out of resentment or self-protection. When had that changed? When had she stopped fighting every moment of this life and started leaning into it? She thought maybe it had been the moment she'd stood at the top of those stairs with a rifle, defending their home. Or maybe it had been earlier, when Caleb had first offered her choice about sleeping arrangements. Or perhaps it had been building gradually since she'd arrived, each small kindness and sign of respect adding up until the weight of them shifted her perspective. They returned to find Tom waiting with news that the mare was showing signs of imminent labor. Caleb wanted to be there for the birth, and Eleanor found herself equally invested. They ate a quick supper, then settled into the barn to wait. The hours passed slowly. Caleb taught Eleanor the signs to watch for, explained what was normal and what would signal trouble. Around midnight, the mare's water broke, and the real labor began. Eleanor had thought birth would be frightening, all blood and pain and danger, and there was pain. She could see it in the mare's straining efforts, but there was also something primal and powerful about it. The mare knew what to do, her body designed for this moment. All Caleb did was stand ready in case assistance was needed, offering quiet encouragement. When the foal finally slipped free in a rush of fluid, landing in the straw, already struggling to stand, Eleanor felt tears on her face. The tiny creature was perfect, long legs still folded awkwardly, wet coat already showing hints of the bay color it would become, dark eyes blinking in the lamplight. "It's a miracle," she whispered. Caleb smiled, checking the foal quickly before stepping back to let the mare do her work. "Every time. No matter how many births I've seen, it never stops feeling like magic." They watched as the mare cleaned her foal as the baby made its first unsteady attempts to stand. After several tries, the foal managed to get its legs under it, swaying but upright. Within minutes, it was nursing, tail flicking contentedly. "New life," Caleb said softly. "New possibilities. Everything this ranch is working toward, right there." Eleanor understood what he meant. This was the point of all the hard work, all the planning and effort, not just profit or success, but this. Creation, continuation, the future made manifest. She leaned into Caleb's side without thinking about it, and his arm came around her shoulders naturally. They stood like that, watching mother and foal, until Eleanor could barely keep her eyes open. "Bed," Caleb ordered gently. "The foal's doing well, and the mare knows what she's about. We can check them in the morning." They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, Caleb's arm still around Eleanor's shoulders. At the base of the stairs, he paused. "Thank you for staying with me tonight, for wanting to see the birth. Thank you for sharing it with me." Eleanor looked up at him, this man who was becoming less of a stranger every day. "Caleb, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Always. Are you happy? With me? With how things are developing between us? I know this isn't the marriage you might have imagined, even when you were planning it. Are you content with the pace we're moving at?" Caleb cupped her face gently. "Eleanor, every day with you is better than I dared hope for. Yes, I want more. I won't lie about that. I want to share a bed with you, want children of our own someday, want all the intimacy that marriage can offer. But I'm also deeply content with where we are now, with the friendship building between us, the partnership, the way you're choosing to be here rather than just enduring it. That's worth more than rushed physical intimacy could ever be. Even though it's been only a week, even though it might take months for me to be ready for more, Even then, his thumb brushed her cheekbone. I told you, I'm good at waiting. And watching you become comfortable here, watching you smile more each day, seeing you build relationships with the families, that's worth every moment of patience. Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and brief. You're a good man, Caleb Monroe. Better than I wanted to believe when I first met you. His answering smile was warm enough to melt her bones. Get some sleep. Tomorrow I want to show you the books we have for the children's lessons. See what else we might need to order from town. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room still, and crawled into bed with a contentment she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Through the wall, she could hear Caleb moving around in his own space, preparing for bed. The sounds were comforting rather than intrusive. She was building a life here, a real life, on her own terms, with a man who respected her enough to wait for her to choose him freely. It wasn't the life Catherine Whitford had imagined for her daughter, but Eleanor thought her mother might approve anyway, might see the strength it took to transform an ugly beginning into something beautiful, to claim agency even when it had been stolen, to choose love even when it had been forced. The days turned into weeks, spring deepening into early summer. Eleanor fell into rhythms that felt increasingly natural, teaching the children in the mornings, working on ranch accounts in the afternoons, riding out with Caleb to check cattle or inspect fences when needed. She learned the names of all the ranch hands, their wives, their children, learned which cows were prone to wandering, which horses had promising bloodlines, which pastures needed rest before regrazing. She also learned Caleb, learned that he was an early riser who did his best thinking while working with his hands, that he had a dry sense of humor that only emerged when he was comfortable, that he was fiercely protective of his people but terrible at expressing emotion with words, that he loved the ranch with an intensity that bordered on reverence. And she learned herself in new ways, discovered she was braver than she'd believed, capable of things she'd never imagined, found that she enjoyed teaching, loved the moment when a child's face lit up with comprehension, realized she had a knack for organization and planning that complemented Caleb's intuitive understanding of animals and land. The separate bedrooms remained, but the distance between them shrank daily. They took meals together, worked side by side in the office, sat on the porch in the evenings talking until the stars came out. Caleb kissed her often now, soft touches of affection rather than demand, morning greetings and nighttime farewells, stolen moments when they passed each other during the day. Eleanor found herself looking forward to those kisses, found herself initiating them sometimes, discovered that she liked the way Caleb's eyes darkened when she did. 6 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor woke to find a letter had arrived from her father. She stared at it over breakfast, the familiar handwriting making her stomach clench. You don't have to read it, Caleb said quietly. You don't owe him anything, Eleanor. I know, but I think I need to. She broke the seal, unfolded the single page. The letter was brief, written in Thomas Whitford's shaky hand. He was leaving Oregon, heading east to live with his brother in Ohio. The cabin and land he was leaving to her. A gesture meant as apology, she supposed, though nothing could truly compensate for what he'd done. He wished her happiness, said he hoped she'd found a way to forgive him someday, and signed it simply Father. Eleanor set the letter down carefully. He's going. How do you feel about that? I don't know. Relieved, maybe? I don't have to worry about running into him in town, about the awkwardness of maintaining distance while living in the same small community. She looked at Caleb. Is that terrible? To be glad my father is leaving? It's honest. After what he did, you don't owe him your grief. Caleb reached across the table, covered her hand with his. The cabin and land are yours now. What do you want to do with them? Eleanor hadn't thought that far ahead. I suppose we could sell them, use the money for ranch improvements. Or you could keep them, as something that's just yours separate from the ranch. Caleb's voice was gentle. I know you didn't get much choice in coming here, Eleanor. Maybe having something that's entirely yours that no one can take from you. Maybe that matters. The thoughtfulness of it made Eleanor's throat tight. Even now, 6 weeks in, Caleb was thinking about her autonomy, her need for something she controlled completely. I'll think about it, she said. Maybe we could use the cabin for ranch hands who get married, want a place of their own, or as a line cabin for the winter pastures. Whatever you decide, it's yours to decide. That night, lying in her bed, Eleanor thought about fathers and choices and the strange paths life took. Thomas Whitford had sold her to save himself, had given up his daughter to preserve his own comfort, but in doing so, he'd inadvertently given her something he never could have intentionally, a chance to discover her own strength, to build a life on her own terms, to choose love rather than simply accepting what was offered. She thought Caleb was probably still awake in his room down the hall, thought about the careful distance they still maintained, the separate bedrooms that gave her space to choose, and realized she was ready to choose something more. Eleanor rose, pulled her wrapper over her nightgown, and walked to Caleb's door. She knocked softly, heard his immediate response. "Come in." He was sitting up in bed, a book in his hands, lamplight casting shadows across his face. When he saw her, his expression shifted to concern. "Eleanor, is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong." She stepped into the room, closed the door behind her. "I just wanted to talk to you about something." Caleb set the book aside, giving her his full attention. "All right." Eleanor took a breath, gathered her courage. "These past weeks, you've been incredibly patient. You've given me space, let me set the pace, never pushed for more than I was ready to give." "I promised I would." "I know. And you've kept that promise, along with every other one you've made me." She moved closer to the bed, saw his breathing quicken slightly. "But I think I'm ready now. Ready to make this a real marriage in every sense." Caleb went very still. "Eleanor, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. That's the point." She sat on the edge of his bed, reached for his hand. "I'm choosing this, Caleb. Choosing you. Not because I'm obligated or trapped, but because I want to. Because I care about you, because you've proven yourself worthy of trust, because I'm tired of sleeping alone when the man I—" She paused, realized what she was about to say, decided to say it anyway. "When the man I love is just down the hall." Caleb's hand tightened on hers. "Say that again." "Which part?" "The part about loving me. Please." Eleanor smiled, feeling tears gather in her eyes. "I love you, Caleb Monroe. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe when you offered me separate rooms. Maybe when you told me the truth about wanting me before the arrangement. Maybe when you stood beside me after I defended our home. But somewhere along the way, I stopped resenting you and started loving you." Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I love you," he said fiercely into her hair. "I love your strength and your courage and your brilliant mind. I love how you are with the children, how you've made this house a home, how you've claimed this life as your own. I love everything about you, Eleanor." She pulled back enough to see his face, saw tears on his cheeks matching her own. "So, can I stay? Here with you instead of down the hall?" "Eleanor, you can have anything you want, anything in my power to give you." "I just want you." She kissed him, deep and sure. "I choose you, Caleb. Freely, completely. You're mine, and I'm yours. And not because any paper says so. Because we've built something real together." Caleb's response was wordless. A kiss that spoke of longing finally fulfilled, of patience rewarded, of love freely given and gratefully received. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark with desire, but also filled with something deeper. "Are you sure?" he asked. "We don't have to rush this just because you said the words." "I'm sure. I've been sure for days now, maybe longer. I was just waiting to be brave enough to act on it." Eleanor stood, untied her wrapper, let it fall. "Make love to me, Caleb. Not because you bought me, but because I'm choosing to give myself to you." What followed was tender and sometimes awkward, two people learning each other's bodies for the first time. But it was also beautiful, made sacred by the choice behind it, by the love that had grown in unexpected soil and bloomed against all odds. Afterward, Eleanor lay in Caleb's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His hand traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and she felt more at peace than she could ever remember feeling. "No regrets?" Caleb asked softly. "None." Eleanor tilted her head to look at him. "You? How could I have regrets about the best thing that's ever happened to me?" He kissed her forehead. "Thank you, Eleanor. for giving me a chance, for seeing past the ugly beginning, for choosing to build something beautiful from it. We built it together. She settled back against his chest. That's what makes it real. They fell asleep tangled together, and when Eleanor woke in the morning to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, Caleb's arms still around her waist, she felt no fear or regret, just contentment and the quiet knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The years that followed brought their own challenges and joys. Eleanor's teaching expanded to include more children as new families joined the ranch. The horse breeding program she developed brought prosperity and recognition, Monroe Ranch becoming known for quality stock across 3 territories. She and Caleb weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated successful cattle drives and the births of foals and calves, and eventually their own children, 3 in total, each wanted and cherished. The cabin her father left her became a schoolhouse, Eleanor's gift to the community she'd come to love. The land was sold to fund books and supplies, ensuring that every child on Monroe Ranch and the surrounding area had access to education. Eleanor never returned to the separate bedroom, never needed the space Caleb had promised to respect, because he made their shared space one of safety and love rather than obligation. They learned each other's bodies and hearts, built a partnership that strengthened with each passing year, proved that love could grow even from the ugliest of beginnings if tended with care and respect. Some nights, lying beside her sleeping husband, their children settled in their own rooms, Eleanor would think about that girl who'd arrived at Monroe Ranch 8 years ago. Angry, frightened, convinced her life was over. She wished she could tell that girl what she knew now, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become doorways to the best things, that strength emerges from trials we never asked for. That love, real love, is always a choice, and choosing it makes it sacred. On their 8th anniversary, Caleb found Eleanor in the schoolhouse she'd built, preparing lessons for the fall term. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her work with the same intensity he'd watched her with that first day when she'd arrived at the ranch. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked without looking up. "About how lucky I am. How a desperate man's debt brought me the greatest gift of my life." Eleanor set down her chalk, crossed to him. At 31, she was more beautiful to him than she'd been at 23, her face showing the wisdom of experience, her eyes holding confidence she'd earned through hard work and harder choices. "It wasn't the debt that brought me to you," she said, sliding her arms around his neck. "It was what you did afterward. The respect, the patience, the choice you gave me to make this marriage my own. Do you ever regret it? Wish things had been different?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she always did when Caleb asked. "I wish I'd had the choice from the beginning. Wish my father hadn't put us both in that position. But regret what we've built? Regret choosing you, choosing this life? Never. Even knowing what it cost you? It cost me my illusions about my father. It cost me the naive belief that life would be fair or that love would come easily." She kissed him softly. "But it gave me everything that matters. A partner who respects me, work that fulfills me, a community I belong to, children I adore. And most importantly, it gave me myself, the woman I became by choosing to be strong, to be brave, to be free even when freedom seemed impossible." Caleb pulled her close. "I love you, Eleanor Monroe. Today, tomorrow, for the rest of our lives. I love you too. And if I had to do it all over again," she paused, smiled, "I'd make the same choice. I'd choose you, choose us, choose this beautiful life we've built together. Not because I had to, but because there's nowhere else I'd rather be." They stood together in the schoolhouse Eleanor had created, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built, the community they'd nurtured, the love they'd chosen daily for 8 years. And Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, that this was exactly where she belonged. The marriage that had begun as a transaction, as a desperate solution to an impossible problem, had become the greatest triumph of her life. Not because it had been easy, but because she'd refused to let it be anything less than real. She'd taken what was forced upon her and made it hers by choice, transformed obligation into love through sheer determination and courage. That night, as they lay together in the bed they'd shared for 8 years, Caleb asked her one more question. "If you could go back to that morning when you received my father's letter, knowing everything that would happen, all of it, would you change anything?" Eleanor thought about the fear and anger, the feeling of being sold like property, the grief of losing the future she'd imagined. She thought about the hard work of learning to trust, the courage it had taken to choose love, the daily effort of building a real marriage from a forced beginning. "No," she said finally, "I wouldn't change a thing. Because every moment, even the terrible ones, brought me here. To you, to our children, to this life, and this life." She touched his face tenderly. "This life is exactly what I would have chosen if I'd been wise enough to know what I truly needed." Caleb kissed her, deep and sure, and Eleanor tasted everything they'd built together in that kiss. Partnership and respect, passion and tenderness, the bone-deep knowledge that they belonged to each other by choice, not compulsion. Outside, the Oregon night was alive with sounds. Horses moving in their pastures, the distant call of an owl, wind rustling through the pines. Inside, Eleanor and Caleb held each other close. Two people who'd found love in the last place they'd expected, who'd built something beautiful from ugly beginnings, who'd proven that choice, real choice, was the only thing that made love sacred. Eleanor fell asleep in her husband's arms, content in the knowledge that tomorrow she'd wake beside him again, that their children would come running with questions and laughter, that the ranch she'd defended with a rifle years ago would need her attention and care. She'd wake to work and love and the beautiful, complicated life she'd chosen, and there was nowhere else she'd rather be.